He stepped over the threshold at 10:45 a.m., as clean as a shadow in a place that sold light. The showroom glowed, polished chrome, leather-stitched like new promises, sunlight slicing through double-height glass. A dozen sales reps moved with rehearsed ease between gleaming hoods. Then, almost absurd against that gloss, an old man in a frayed shirt and faded jacket walked in. His shoes scuffed, a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder. To everyone watching, he looked like someone the pavement had worn thin. To most of them, he belonged outside the doors. "What do you want?" A voice cut, low and impatient. Victor Sterling, the general manager, was already there, his tie a statement, and his smile a practiced currency. Around him, the room hummed with quick, private jokes. Chloe Adams, tidy in a blazer that matched the showroom sheen, tapped her phone and laughed too softly to sound innocent. Even Steve, who usually kept a crooked grin for everyone, let his grin settle into a smirk. Ryan Parker felt the room with a different sensitivity. Junior sales associate, 28. He'd learned to read balance sheets and temper egos, to keep calm when a client pressed for discounts and when a manager shouted across polished glass. He'd learned the language of closing deals. He had not, until that moment, learned the particular shame of watching someone be seen as less than human. The old man moved deliberately, carrying no desperation in his shoulders, only a calm, careful step. When he reached the center of the floor, he paused and looked at the cars as if remembering something that had once belonged to him. No one offered a chair. No one offered a smile. "Excuse me?" he said softly. He spoke with a voice shaped by years. It didn't tremble. It asked for something simple, to speak with the manager. The room tightened. Victor raised an eyebrow. "We don't do soliciting here," he said. The kind of line practiced for people in suits and for people who could be pushed out easily. The old man's hands were steady as he reached into his bag and produced a plain, sealed envelope. He held it like a thing that might be easily broken. He scanned the faces in the room and met Ryan's eyes as if choosing someone to trust. Would you?" he began, then stopped. He folded the envelope as if to hand it across, then changed his mind. "Could you give this to the manager?" he said. "Alone, please." It was a small request. It was nothing by the measures the room valued. But Ryan felt, in his palm, the weight of that sealed paper as if it were a confession or a map. He stepped forward. He guided the old man to one of the leather chairs near the window. He fetched a glass of water. He pulled his own jacket off and draped it over the man's shoulders for a second, before remembering himself and smiling awkward human. The old man accepted the jacket for a heartbeat, then shook his head with a smile that creased his face like a canyon. "You don't have to do this," the old man said, quiet enough that only Ryan heard. "But if you don't, someone else will throw it away." The gesture was small. Offer a seat, bring water, take an envelope. In the world of sales targets and quarterly reports, that was nearly invisible. To the old man, and to the instinct that lived in Ryan's chest, it was everything. Victor watched the exchange like a man watching a dog beg for a table scrape. "This is ridiculous," he said, loud enough for the room. "We can't be interrupted by vagrants." Sir, I asked you to accept this," the old man said. His voice held no tremor. Just for a moment. Victor's lips tightened. He reached for the envelope as if it were a nuisance. He peered at the front, but then tossed it aside onto the coffee table, half out of irritation, half to show he did not care. The room snickered. Chloe's eyes flashed. She covered a laugh with a cough. Ryan saw the envelope slide. Saw a corner catch on a threadbare seam and fluttered the way truth sometimes flutters when ignored. He could have walked away. He could have done what the rest did and let the image of that man be the story. Instead, he bent down, picked up the envelope, and placed it in his inner jacket pocket. His heart gave a lurch. He hadn't planned to take on anything that morning except another set of clients and another morning coffee. But he had put the envelope somewhere safe. The old man thanked him in a voice that did not demand gratitude. He left the showroom with the same calm stride he had when he entered. People returned to their polished routines. Victor barked orders. Chloe started on a follow-up email. The moment leaked away, like rain off chrome. No one in that room connected the small kindness to anything larger. They saw what fit their assumptions, a man who appeared to be a beggar, and a team that would not be inconvenienced. Or if this is speaking to you, pause for a second. Think of the last time you sized someone up by what they wore, or how they entered your life. What small gesture could you make today that costs nothing but might mean everything? Comment below with one action you'll try. That night, the showroom lights dimmed and the building exhaled. Ryan sat at his desk after closing, the city's neon a distant wash on the glass. He could have gone home. His mother expected him for dinner. His phone buzzed with a text about the team's plans for the weekend. But the envelope in his jacket pocket felt like a seed waiting for soil. He unfolded it at his desk and slid his finger under the flap. Inside was a single card name stamped in ink he recognized from old photographs, N.S. Rutherford. The ink was faint, the initials formal, in a way that suggested history. There was a note, brief and handwritten, for the manager of Prestige Auto, a memory, confidential. Ryan's throat tightened. N.S. Rutherford. The name belonged to a person people in the city spoke of in soft reverence, an old founder who had built Valorant Holdings from a small garage into something the skyline recognized. He lived off the grid for years, a reclusive figure who had long since traded his office for quiet afternoons. He had not been involved in day-to-day operations for decades. Why would he appear in an envelope in a dealership? Why would he ask to see a manager in a place that called itself Prestige Auto Gallery? Ryan could have delivered the envelope the next morning and let the memory stay private. He could have slipped into the pattern of polite indifference that had governed the showroom that day. Instead, he felt something else rising, the way Victor had rolled his shoulders when the old man asked to be heard. The way Chloe's cigarette smile had told him worry was optional and whimsy was not. He thought of the man's steady hands, the quiet that had not needed explanation. He thought of how easy it had been for the room to dismiss a person. He opened his laptop and wrote a short, clear email directed to Valorant's corporate compliance address. He explained, without flourish, what he had seen. He attached a brief note. Manager declined to speak. Sealed envelope, given to me. I saved it. He added the photo of the card with Rutherford's name. He pushed send. It took only minutes for a response to ping back. Received. We are reviewing. Please hold. Then followed the hum of public life. A closed caption on a news program. A message from his friend about drinks. The low static of a city that rarely stopped moving. Sleep was a thin thing that night. Ryan imagined 100 possible outcomes. Nothing. A courteous reply, and perhaps a reprimand for stepping out of his lane. He tried to reason the impulse away. He had done his part. People who mattered would decide what mattered next. In the morning, the dealership was noisy with work. People exchanged weekend stories, lined up bells, and filed paperwork. Ryan kept the envelope in his pocket, like a beating heart. At 10 in the morning, the reception phone chirped with an unfamiliar ring. The receptionist's pale expression changed the room's air. Mr. Rutherford is on his way, she said, voice flat but steady. And he's bringing guests. A hush fell that held the floor like a hand. SUVs arrived. The board's lawyers wore suits that spoke of certainty. They stepped under the glass doors and into a room suddenly too small for the moment. The old man who had come the day before walked in again, but this time he did not wear frayed clothes. He wore a coat over his arm. He moved with the same calm. He was the same person, only the room now saw someone else. The people who had scoffed the day before saw instead a figure who carried weight, not because of the material he wore, but because his name carried a legacy. He removed his hat and walked straight toward the center of the floor. There was no need for dramatics. Rutherford's voice was calm and unadorned. "I was told someone tried to hand this to my manager yesterday," he said, and he held up the envelope the way the weather holds up, everything indifferent and real. Ryan felt the air tighten like a drum. Victor's face went to color between surprise and calculation. He smiled. It came out thin. "Mr. Rutherford, we're honored," he said, but the words lacked the weight that the greeting should have had. He gestured as if to gather the moment into a scripted line. "We can help you." Rutherford did not look at Victor the way one looks at a subordinate. He looked as if he were surveying not a man, but a responsibility. A legal counsel stepped forward and produced a tablet, footage from the showroom's cameras. The footage played on a screen mounted for sales presentations about features now. It showed faces. It showed the way the team had leaned away as the old man entered. It showed Victor reaching for the envelope, then discarding it as if it were less than paper. It showed Ryan bending down, rescuing the envelope, placing it in his pocket with a tenderness that could not be mistaken. Silence does something to people. It makes their features honest for a moment. The footage removed excuses. It did not shout. It simply resolved the shape of reality. Victor's mouth opened. The color fell from Chloe's cheeks. The smirk on Steve's face fled like a bird startled into flight. Rutherford folded his hands together. He did not speak to humiliate. He spoke to correct. "This company began with a promise," he said, and the words were small, but carried an old, steady authority. "We promised to treat people with dignity. We did not promise that everyone would be rich in appearance or in dress. We promised respect. That promise is not an ornament." He looked at Victor. "Mr. Sterling, you have been a driving force here, but leadership is not a position. It's a practice. You have practiced exclusion today." He turned then to the room, eyes landing on each selling face as if cataloging what they might become. "That ends here." There were consequences pronounced plainly and without spectacle. Victor would be suspended while the company conducted an internal review. He would be reassigned to oversee the service center, a role where he would be closer to the customers he had seemed so ready to dismiss. A place where his judgment could be tested in service rather than sales. Chloe would be placed on probation and required to attend a workshop on client dignity and leadership accountability. The staff would undergo training, and the company would instate a clearer protocol for customer engagement. The measures were corrective rather than punitive, meant to restore a culture more than to punish a failure. And then Rutherford looked at Ryan. The room exhaled, waiting to see whether the man who had been dismissed so casually the day before would now be given a place among the pillars. "You," Rutherford said, "you did what was right when it wasn't convenient. That matters more than anything on a balance sheet." He reached across the small space, placed the sealed envelope back into Ryan's hand, and said, "We will make sure this starts where it should. I would like you to join us at Valorant's headquarters next week for a conversation." Change in the room unfolded quickly. It was not magic. It was human procedure emails, meetings, HR memos, but it came from a person who had the authority to make decisions and the will to hold people to a standard. Overnight, in the sense work transformed into consequence, lines in people's lives shifted. Ryan's name was entered more prominently in the organizational charts. Victor was removed from his leadership perch and sent to learn the humbling work he had ignored. Chloe faced the inconvenience of re-education. The dealership's culture, once brittle with arrogance, began to crack and be repaired. What Ryan had done was simple. He had listened. He had offered a seat and a glass of water. He had kept the envelope safe. And he had told the truth not with grand declarations, but with a clear, concise email that moved through an organization and reached people who could do something about it. The action itself cost him nothing. The consequence transformed him overnight. A promotion to assistant general manager appeared on a formal letter within days. The result of Rutherford's decision and the board's fast review. The change was precise. The company had found in him the kind of temperament that steadied judgment under pressure. The story did not end in vindication alone. Victor's demotion was not the last scene for him. The service center became, to his surprise, a place of slow redemption. Surrounded now by technicians and customers who expected honest time and clear answers, he found that leadership required different things: listening, patience, learning. The first weeks were humiliating. He had to master new knowledge, and his hands, once accustomed to signing contracts, now had to learn to grip a spanner. He apologized to the man he had dismissed, genuinely and without pretense. And the apology did not erase the past, but it began the work of restoring a person who had chosen to step back and learn. Chloe's probation changed her too. She had never believed she needed correction. The training forced her into awkward rooms where she listened and confronted the brittle edges of her assumptions. Gradually, she learned how little humor helps when it wounded someone else. It took time, and sometimes pride willfully resisted. But she began to answer differently when the door opened and someone stepped into their showroom with a life less polished than the cars around them. The old man Rutherford, when he chose to reveal himself, kept his own counsel about why he had visited. He told no one in the building that he had been testing them. He did not say that he had been watching the company's ethos fray, or that he had kept anniversaries in quiet rooms. What he did say to Ryan in private, when the bustle quieted, was this: "You did not see a rag. You saw a person. That is why I asked you here." Weeks later, Ryan found himself in the lobby of Valoran's headquarters, a building that matched the city's skyline, and yet somehow felt less grand inside, more careful with its space. Rutherford's office was modest in the way that older men are modest when the years teach restraint. He poured tea from a pot that had a small chip at the lip, and they sat near a window that looked out over a courtyard where trees had been planted long ago. "You did not seek notice," Rutherford said, looking at Ryan with the steady attention of someone who set bookmarks in human lives. "You acted as if dignity were not an optional expense. That is leadership. I want to give you a chance to steward something bigger than a showroom." It was not an immediate offer for riches or power. It was an invitation to head a new philanthropic trust. Rutherford was forming a program to support small entrepreneurs, to provide microgrants for people whose appearances often masked their potential, to teach businesses how to serve with respect. Ryan listened, his hands wrapped around the warm cup. The idea of a trust excited him, because he had always believed business could be a form of care when it did not pretend to be more than it was. The trust's offer would come after conversations and plans. It was not instant wealth or a fairy tale beyond the reach of work. It was a responsibility designed to turn one small act into many, applying the same dignity in countless situations, shifting systems that otherwise calcify into prejudice. When Ryan returned to Prestige Auto Gallery after that first week, things had changed structurally and subtly. The staff moved more carefully. The training program placed a mirror in front of each employee. The culture shift had a rhythm. Awkward apologies, honest feedback sessions, the slow accretion of trust. Sales went on. Cars shone under lights. People still came in who expected a certain kind of reception. Some left unsoothed. Some stayed because someone finally looked at them straight in the eye and asked what they needed. The small gesture that had begun everything, the seat offered, the glass of water, the decision to keep a piece of paper safe, had multiplied into a new cadence. It was not that every heart suddenly turned tender. It was that systems once indifferent were nudged. It was that one person's quiet choice made the case for dignity louder than the excuses of efficiency and image. There were moments of friction. Victor did not find the service center easy. He said things he would later regret, then had to repair them. In the months that followed, he learned how to listen to the mechanics and to read customers' faces differently. There were days he wanted his old office back, days he suspected change was temporary. Those days taught him to choose differently. Chloe, forced into probation, began to mentor a junior staffer about humility. Steve found small ways to keep the mood light without being cruel. The dealership took steps that any corporation could take. Clearer values posted where staff would read them every morning. A training budget expanded. A review process that included customer dignity as a metric. For Ryan, the overnight transformation continued to echo. His promotion to assistant general manager was a real letter with a desk key and a new email signature, but it did not change the thing that had always defined his work. Whether he could hold the integrity to do the right thing when it was not popular. He still made cold calls, negotiated with car buyers, and answered the late-night messages that sales never stops delivering. But now he carried new obligations policy meetings, training modules, the kind of authority that could either be used to entrench old ways or to seed better ones. In a small way, the city itself noticed. People started to tell the story not as gossip, but as a tiny parable about the cost of a look and the payoff of a caring action. The local paper ran a piece about leadership and humility. A podcast host interviewed Rutherford about corporate culture. People who had once walked through showrooms without thinking twice began to think differently when they saw someone who did not fit their mental model of a customer. None of it felt miraculous. It felt human and, therefore, fragile. Change required attention. It required people who would act when it was easier to look away. It required a board that could move swiftly, and a founder who still cared enough to use his power for correction rather than applause. Most of all, it required a junior sales associate who placed a small envelope safely in his pocket, who took a moment to offer a seat, who wrote an email when he could have kept silent. Months later, in the service center, Victor stood by an open hood and listened as a mechanic explained the problem. The man had oil on his hands, and a kind of patience Victor had not expected to have to pay for. Victor apologized in a low voice for the way he had treated people. The apology did not erase yesterday, but it rewired the future. He stayed longer in the service center than anyone thought he would, and in doing so learned that leadership is sometimes the discipline of learning to be less than you were yesterday. The old man Rutherford kept his public appearances minimal. He would visit other branches when necessary, sit on panels when invited, but mostly he worked through calendars and calls. He had come not to be lauded, but to remind a company that its original promise mattered still. And Ryan, who had been transformed by one overnight act of recognition, did not forget the smallness of what had begun it. A cup of water, a chair, a hand that reached into a pocket and refused to let dignity fall. The envelope itself remained with Ryan for a while, tucked into a desk drawer like a relic whose meaning was no longer secret. Some nights, he would touch the edge of the paper and remember the man's quiet gravity. He kept the moment close, not because it made him feel good, but because it made him responsible. In the months that followed, the philanthropic trust took shape. It offered microgrants, mentorship programs, and a series of workshops aimed at businesses that wanted to practice dignity as an operating principle. Ryan helped write some of the initial guidelines, using the memory of a small, sealed paper as his guiding north. The trust's work was imperfect. Not every grant led to success. Not every trainee adopted the ethic, but the seed had been scattered. It landed in more places than one storefront. People asked Ryan, sometimes in conversation and sometimes in formal interviews, whether he had expected his life to change so quickly. He would laugh, a little incredulous, and say, no. He had only done a small thing. He had only given a man a seat and kept a paper safe. But he meant it when he said that small things have a way of finding doors. At the dealership, there were new rituals. A morning stand-up began with a single question. How will we show dignity today? It sounded simple in the way rituals often do, but it bent decision-making, slowed a glance meant to dismiss, made space for listening. These were not grand reforms. They were micro-practices that rewired behavior. On a quiet afternoon, long after the cameras had replayed the moment that humbled a team, Ryan found himself standing by a vintage Cara relic that prestige kept as a charmless ornament. He placed the original envelope on its hood, the paper still soft from being handled. He thought of the man who had walked in looking like a beggar and of the way people had measured value by appearance. He thought of the ripple that began with a small act of care. One small gesture changed a life overnight. By life you mean the course of a career. The immediate arc of a man's reputation, the sudden shift of consequence, and the beginning of accountability. That evening, as the showroom lights cooled and the city breathed, Ryan realized the gesture had done something else. It demanded that people choose, every day, who they wanted to be. If this story moved you, if it woke something in you that wants to act differently, then carry one small action into the world today. Offer a seat, pick up an envelope, write a note when no one else will. If you believe dignity matters, subscribe and share this story so more people remember to see the person before the appearance.